Ted Bundy is one of the most infamous serial killers in history. His name evokes both fear and fascination, as his charm and intellect mask the horrifying crimes he committed. This video delves into the life and crimes of Ted Bundy, a man who left a dark stain on American history by preying on over 30 women, earning him a death sentence. Join us as we explore his beginnings, his reign of terror, and the eventual justice that brought his evil acts to an end. Ted Bundy's early life is a complex and deeply troubling story, filled with layers of secrecy, abandonment, and a search for identity that may have influenced the dark path he eventually took. Born on November 24, 1946 in Burlington, Vermont, he entered the world under a shroud of scandal. His mother, Eleanor Louise Cowell, was unmarried at the time, a significant social stigma during the 1940s. To protect the family's reputation, Bundy's grandparents stepped in, raising him as their own child while pretending his mother was his older sister. This deception created a web of confusion for young Ted, who only learned the truth later in life, a revelation that deeply unsettled him. Bundy's biological father remains a mystery. Various records suggest different possibilities, but none have been confirmed. Some reports name a man named Lloyd Marshall, while others point to Jack Worthington, but the lack of clarity only adds to the enigmatic and turbulent nature of Bundy's formative years. His mother never spoke publicly about his father, leaving Bundy with a void where a paternal figure should have been. This absence of a stable and transparent family structure became one of the many fractures in his early life. Growing up in Philadelphia, Bundy lived under the strict and often authoritarian rule of his grandfather, Samuel Cowell. While publicly respected, Samuel was described by family members as a deeply troubled and violent man. He was known for his temper, verbal and physical abuse, and extreme control over the household. Ted's grandmother suffered from depression and agoraphobia, further contributing to the instability of his upbringing. These early experiences likely exposed Bundy to a household filled with conflict, fear, and suppressed emotions. Despite the chaos at home, Bundy displayed early signs of intelligence and charm. However, he also exhibited troubling behaviors. Relatives recalled instances where young Ted showed an unusual fascination with macabre subjects. In one particularly disturbing incident, he was said to have surrounded his sleeping aunt with knives, standing by silently as she awoke to find him staring at her. While such incidents could be dismissed as childish mischief, they hint at a darker psychological undercurrent even in his youth. When Bundy was a young boy, his mother relocated to Tacoma, Washington, taking him with her. It was here that she married Johnny Bundy, a man who would give Ted his last name. Johnny Bundy was a hard-working but unremarkable man who worked as a hospital cook. He tried to bond with Ted, taking him on camping trips and engaging in outdoor activities. But Ted never accepted Johnny as his father. Instead, he resented him for his modest socioeconomic status, which contrasted sharply with Ted's aspirations of wealth and status. During his adolescence, Bundy struggled with feelings of inadequacy and social alienation. While he was intelligent and did well academically, he found it difficult to connect with his peers. He often felt out of place and resorted to petty theft and voyeurism as a way to assert control and seek thrills. These behaviors, seemingly minor at the time, would later escalate into something far more sinister. Bundy's relationship with women during his formative years also warrants examination. He was often awkward and shy around girls, a stark contrast to the charming persona he would later develop. His first serious romantic relationship during college ended in heartbreak when the woman, who came from a wealthy and influential family, broke things off, citing Bundy's lack of direction and ambition. This rejection profoundly impacted him, fueling a deep sense of inadequacy and resentment toward women. Some experts believe this relationship and its subsequent failure played a significant role in shaping Bundy's motives and the psychological profile of his future victims. Bundy's childhood and early years are a mosaic of contradictions. On the surface, he appeared to be a bright young man with potential, but beneath that facade lay a troubled individual grappling with identity, rejection, and a burgeoning darkness. These early experiences, marked by familial dysfunction, emotional isolation, and unresolved trauma, set the stage for the horrors that would later unfold. Understanding Bundy's origins is crucial in comprehending the making of one of history's most notorious serial killers. Ted Bundy was not the typical image of a monster. He was the epitome of charm, confidence, and sophistication, qualities that allowed him to manipulate and deceive those around him effortlessly. This duality, the handsome, articulate law student on one side and the cold-blooded predator on the other, was central to his ability to evade suspicion and commit his heinous crimes. Bundy's charm and intelligence were his weapons, enabling him to mask his true nature and exploit the trust of those he encountered. Bundy first began to cultivate his charismatic persona during his college years. As a young man, he was well-spoken and socially adept, traits that stood in stark contrast to the awkward, introverted boy he had been in high school. He attended the University of Washington, where he studied psychology, and his professors regarded him as a bright and promising student. He even worked as a crisis hotline volunteer alongside Anne Rule, who would later write one of the definitive accounts of his life. Rule described him as empathetic and caring during their time together, a chilling irony given his later crimes. One of Bundy's most unsettling traits was his ability to seamlessly blend into society. He appeared normal, someone you might trust to help you carry groceries or change a flat tire. This normalcy was critical to his success as a predator. Unlike the stereotypical image of a disheveled, menacing criminal, Bundy was meticulous in his appearance. He dressed well, maintained a clean-cut look, and could carry engaging conversations on a variety of topics. This ability to appear unthreatening allowed him to approach his victims without raising alarm. Bundy's charm wasn't just surface level. It was a carefully honed tool that he used to manipulate his victims and even those investigating his crimes. He often feigned vulnerability or distress to lure women into his trap. For instance, he would wear a fake cast on his arm or leg and struggle with mundane tasks like carrying books or loading items into his car. When a kind-hearted woman approached to offer assistance, Bundy would strike, abducting her before anyone could notice she was missing. This tactic exploited the empathy and trust of his victims, turning their kindness into a fatal vulnerability. His ability to manipulate wasn't limited to strangers. Bundy also maintained romantic relationships, often using his charm to gain the trust and affection of women who had no idea of his dark side. His long-term girlfriend, Elizabeth Klopfer, remained with him for years despite mounting suspicions about his behavior. She described him as loving and attentive, though he sometimes displayed unsettling tendencies, such as a fixation on crime stories and a cold detachment in certain situations. Bundy's ability to maintain this facade of normalcy, even with someone close to him, highlights the depth of his duplicity. Bundy's charm extended beyond his interactions with women. He was also skilled at manipulating authority figures, law enforcement, and even the media. During his trial, he represented himself, using his legal knowledge and self-confidence to create a spectacle that captivated the public. He charmed reporters and court officials, giving interviews that showcased his intelligence and wit. This ability to present himself as an articulate and reasonable man caused many to question whether someone so composed could be capable of such horrific crimes. Bundy's charisma wasn't just a tool for deception, it was also a source of power and control. He relished the attention and admiration he received, using it to feed his ego and create a sense of superiority over others. This need for dominance extended to his crimes, where he exerted complete control over his victims, often toying with them psychologically before ending their lives. His charm and intellect were not merely traits but essential components of his modus operandi, enabling him to operate in plain sight while committing acts of unimaginable cruelty. In retrospect, Bundy's charisma serves as a chilling reminder of the dangers of superficial judgments. His charm and intelligence masked a deeply disturbed individual, allowing him to manipulate those around him and evade suspicion for years. Understanding how he used these traits to his advantage is crucial to comprehending the depth of his depravity. Ted Bundy was not an ordinary man. He was a predator who weaponized trust and likability, turning the very qualities that made him appear human into tools for committing inhuman acts. Ted Bundy's ability to elude capture for so long was largely due to his calculated and methodical approach to his crimes. He was not an impulsive killer. Instead, he meticulously planned each step, from selecting his victims to executing his attacks and disposing of evidence. Bundy's ability to blend into society while maintaining a double life as a predator underscores the depth of his cunning and the chilling precision with which he carried out his murders. Bundy's primary hunting ground was college campuses, where he could easily find young women who matched his preferred victim profile. He typically targeted women in their late teens or early 20s, often brunettes who parted their hair in the middle, a detail that has fueled speculation about whether they resembled someone from his past, possibly his ex-girlfriend who had rejected him. Bundy's victims were usually kind-hearted, approachable women, a characteristic he exploited to gain their trust. To lure his victims, Bundy often employed deceptive tactics that played on their sense of empathy and willingness to help others. One of his most infamous ploys involved him pretending to be injured or disabled. Wearing a fake cast or sling, he would struggle to carry books, load items into his Volkswagen Beetle, or navigate stairs. When an unsuspecting woman offered assistance, he would overpower her, swiftly incapacitating her and forcing her into his vehicle. Once inside, the car itself became a tool of captivity. Bundy had removed the passenger seat to make it easier to hide his victims and prevent them from escaping. Bundy's calculated approach extended to his choice of locations for his attacks and body disposal. He favored remote areas such as wooded regions, mountains, and lakesides, where he could commit his crimes without the risk of being observed. These secluded spots allowed him to maintain complete control over his victims, prolonging their suffering and further satisfying his need for dominance. After committing the murders, Bundy would often revisit the sites, engaging in necrophilic acts and reliving the crimes in his mind, an act that reveals the depth of his depravity. Despite the horrific nature of his actions, Bundy maintained an extraordinary level of composure and normalcy in his day-to-day life. He continued his studies, held jobs, and even volunteered for political campaigns, all while committing his murders. This dual existence was key to his ability to evade detection. By all outward appearances, he was a promising young man with a bright future, someone who seemed incapable of the atrocities he was secretly carrying out. Bundy's cross-state killing spree added another layer of complexity to his crimes and helped him avoid capture for years. Unlike most serial killers who operate within a localized area, Bundy frequently traveled, targeting women in multiple states including Washington, Oregon, Utah, Colorado, and Florida. This mobility made it difficult for law enforcement to connect the crimes, as each jurisdiction worked independently without sharing information. It wasn't until the development of multi-agency task forces and the sharing of evidence that investigators began to piece together the full extent of his actions. His adaptability and intelligence made him an even more formidable adversary for law enforcement. Bundy was meticulous about covering his tracks, leaving behind minimal evidence and frequently changing his methods to avoid establishing a clear pattern. For instance, while his earlier crimes involved luring women into his car under the pretense of needing help, some of his later attacks were more brazen, such as his assault on multiple women at the Chi Omega sorority house. These shifts in his behavior kept investigators guessing and made it harder for them to predict his next move. Bundy's charm and intellect also played a role in evading suspicion. He was often described as polite and cooperative during encounters with police, disarming them with his demeanor. Even when he was arrested in 1975 for the first time on suspicion of evading police in Utah, authorities had no idea they were dealing with a serial killer. At the time, he was merely a suspect in an attempted kidnapping, and his ability to explain away inconsistencies in his story delayed further scrutiny. Bundy's calculated nature extended to his ability to manipulate those around him. He exploited the media frenzy surrounding his crimes to create a narrative that worked in his favor. During interviews, he portrayed himself as a victim of wrongful accusation, a man who was being persecuted despite his innocence. This performance was so convincing that he even gained supporters who refused to believe he could be guilty of such heinous acts. This manipulation allowed him to maintain his freedom longer than many serial killers and contributed to the widespread fear and confusion that accompanied his killing spree. In examining Bundy's calculated approach to his crimes, one is struck by the stark contrast between his outward persona and the predator lurking beneath. He was a man who thrived on control, planning every detail of his attacks and relishing the power he held over his victims. Bundy's ability to move undetected through society, committing murder after murder, is a testament to his cunning and the terrifying effectiveness of his methods. His story serves as a chilling reminder of how appearances can be deceiving and how calculated evil can hide in plain sight. Ted Bundy's first arrest in 1975 marked the beginning of the unraveling of his carefully constructed facade, though it was far from the end of his crimes or manipulative schemes. This initial encounter with law enforcement was not for murder, but for an attempted kidnapping, and even then his true nature remained hidden. However, the events leading up to and following his arrest would set the stage for investigators to uncover the depths of his depravity. In August 1975, Ted Bundy was living in Utah, where he was enrolled at the University of Utah Law School. By this time, several young women had disappeared in the region, but there was no concrete evidence linking Bundy to these crimes. Despite his charm and intelligence, cracks were beginning to appear in his carefully maintained image. Suspicion was growing among those who knew him, including his long-term girlfriend Elizabeth Klupfer, who had alerted authorities to her concerns about Bundy's behavior. Bundy's arrest came almost by chance during a routine traffic stop. A Utah Highway Patrol officer noticed Bundy's tan Volkswagen Beetle driving suspiciously in a residential area late at night. When the officer attempted to pull him over, Bundy fled, leading to a brief high-speed chase. Eventually, Bundy stopped, and the officer arrested him for evading law enforcement. What seemed like a minor incident at first quickly took a darker turn when the officer searched Bundy's car. Inside the Volkswagen Beetle, police found a disturbing collection of items: a crowbar, a ski mask, handcuffs, trash bags, an ice pick, and rope. These items, often referred to as his kill kit, were clear indicators that Bundy was preparing to commit a violent crime. The presence of these tools was enough to arouse suspicion, and Bundy was taken into custody for questioning. Despite the mounting evidence, Bundy maintained his composure, denying any wrongdoing and portraying himself as a victim of circumstance. At this point, investigators were beginning to connect Bundy to a series of unsolved crimes. Witnesses in earlier cases, such as the abductions of Janice Ott and Denise Naslund from Lake Sammamish State Park, had described a man who called himself Ted and drove a Volkswagen Beetle. The similarities between those descriptions and Bundy were impossible to ignore. Authorities began to dig deeper, uncovering more links between Bundy and the disappearances of young women in Washington, Oregon, and Utah. Bundy's arrest provided investigators with their first major breakthrough, but they still lacked the evidence needed to charge him with murder. Instead, they focused on an attempted kidnapping case from earlier that year. In November 1974, a young woman named Carol Duranch had narrowly escaped an attack by a man posing as a police officer. The attacker had lured her into his car, claiming her vehicle had been broken into, but she managed to fight him off and flee. When shown a lineup, Duranch identified Bundy as her assailant, leading to his indictment for attempted kidnapping. Bundy's trial for the Duranch case took place in February 1976, and it was a pivotal moment in the investigation. Despite his efforts to appear composed and innocent, the evidence against him was compelling. Duranch's testimony was particularly damning, as she recounted her terrifying ordeal in vivid detail. Bundy was found guilty and sentenced to 15 years in prison, marking the first time he was held accountable for his crimes. While incarcerated, Bundy continued to deny involvement in any murders, maintaining his innocence and using his charm to manipulate those around him. However, investigators were not convinced. Detectives from multiple states began comparing notes, sharing information, and building a case that would link Bundy to a series of murders. This collaborative effort was unprecedented at the time, as law enforcement agencies were often reluctant to share information across jurisdictions. As the investigation progressed, Bundy's past came under intense scrutiny. Authorities learned about his movements during the time of the murders and the striking similarities between his victims. They also uncovered reports from witnesses who had seen Bundy in the areas where women had gone missing. Piece by piece, the puzzle of Bundy's crimes was coming together, and the scope of his violence was becoming horrifyingly clear. Despite the growing evidence, Bundy remained confident that he could outsmart the system. He used his legal knowledge to file appeals, represent himself in court, and exploit loopholes in the legal process. His charm and intelligence made him a difficult adversary, but investigators were determined to bring him to justice. The discovery of physical evidence, such as fibers and hair that linked Bundy to his victims, strengthened their case and provided the critical proof needed to move forward with murder charges. Bundy's first arrest was a turning point in his story. While it did not immediately end his killing spree, it marked the beginning of the end for his reign of terror. The arrest exposed his vulnerabilities, brought his actions into the public eye, and united law enforcement agencies in their pursuit of justice. It also revealed the terrifying extent to which Bundy was willing to go to maintain his freedom, foreshadowing the escapes and courtroom theatrics that would follow. Though he managed to evade capture for many of his crimes up to this point, Bundy's arrest in Utah was the first crack in his carefully constructed facade. It marked the moment when the world began to see the true face of the man behind the charming smile, and it set the stage for the eventual unraveling of his web of lies and violence. Ted Bundy's escapes from custody are among the most audacious and infamous episodes in the history of criminal justice. They underscore not only his intelligence and resourcefulness, but also the systemic failures that allowed a man so dangerous to slip through the cracks. These escapes not only prolonged Bundy's killing spree, but also demonstrated the lengths he was willing to go to maintain his freedom and continue his horrific acts. The first escape occurred in June 1977, while Bundy was awaiting trial in Aspen, Colorado, for the murder of Corinne Campbell, a nurse who had disappeared from a hotel in Snowmass the previous year. Bundy, representing himself, convinced the court to allow him access to the Pitkin County Courthouse Law Library so he could prepare his defense. This privilege was a calculated move on Bundy's part, as it provided him with the opportunity he needed to plan his escape. On June 7th, Bundy was left unshackled in the library, under the assumption that he posed no immediate threat. He used this opportunity to open a second-story window and jump to the ground, injuring his ankle in the process. Despite the injury, Bundy managed to evade capture by blending into the wilderness. He had spent months studying maps of the area and was familiar with the terrain, which allowed him to survive in the mountains for nearly a week. However, his lack of preparation for long-term survival led to his recapture on June 13th, when he was spotted by police while attempting to steal a car. Although his first escape was short-lived, it showcased Bundy's cunning and determination. More importantly, it revealed the vulnerabilities in the legal system and the underestimation of Bundy's capabilities. Authorities tightened security measures following his recapture, but Bundy was already plotting his next move. The second escape occurred on December 30th, 1977, and was even more daring and meticulously planned. By this time, Bundy had been transferred to the Garfield County Jail in Glenwood Springs, Colorado. Over several weeks, he lost weight and carved a hole in the ceiling of his cell, gaining access to a crawl space. Bundy's ability to manipulate his environment and plan his moves in secret speaks to his intelligence and patience. On the night of his escape, Bundy climbed through the crawl space and into the apartment of the jailer, who was out for the evening. He stole civilian clothes and walked out of the jail, completely unnoticed. Bundy's escape went undetected until the following day, giving him a crucial head start. This time he was far better prepared, and his escape set off a nationwide manhunt. Bundy made his way to Chicago, then to Michigan, and eventually to Florida, leaving law enforcement in disarray as they scrambled to track his movements. His ability to cross multiple state lines undetected demonstrated not only his resourcefulness, but also the limitations of law enforcement communication and coordination at the time. Bundy took full advantage of these gaps, effectively disappearing for weeks. While on the run, Bundy resumed his killing spree. In Florida, he attacked 4 women at the Chi Omega sorority house at Florida State University on January 15, 1978, killing 2 of them and severely injuring the others. Less than an hour later, he attacked another woman, Cheryl Thomas, in her nearby apartment, leaving her with permanent injuries. These attacks were especially brutal and marked a significant escalation in Bundy's violence. It was as though his time in captivity had intensified his rage, leading to even more horrific acts upon his escape. Bundy's freedom came to an end on February 15, 1978, when he was arrested by police in Pensacola, Florida. Once again, it was a routine traffic stop that led to his capture. The officer who pulled him over noticed that Bundy's car, a stolen Volkswagen Beetle, was reported as suspicious. Inside the vehicle, police found stolen credit cards and other items linking Bundy to crimes in Florida. This arrest finally brought an end to Bundy's ability to evade justice, but the cost of his freedom had been devastating. Bundy's escapes highlight several troubling aspects of his personality and the system's failure to contain him. His ability to exploit weaknesses in security measures and manipulate those around him underscores his intelligence and adaptability. At the same time, these escapes reveal the systemic issues in law enforcement and the judicial process at the time, including a lack of interagency communication and inadequate precautions for dealing with a suspect as dangerous as Bundy. The escapes also provide insight into Bundy's mindset. His refusal to remain in custody, despite overwhelming evidence against him, speaks to his sense of superiority and belief that he could outsmart the system. Bundy thrived on control, and his escapes were as much about asserting his dominance over law enforcement as they were about avoiding punishment. They were calculated moves that allowed him to prolong his freedom and, tragically, his killing spree. In retrospect, Bundy's escapes are a chilling reminder of the dangers posed by someone with his combination of intelligence, charm, and psychopathy. They serve as a stark lesson for the criminal justice system about the importance of vigilance, communication, and never underestimating the capabilities of those in custody. For Bundy's victims and their families, these escapes were a devastating failure of justice, allowing a man who should have been stopped to inflict even more pain and suffering. Ted Bundy's time in Florida marked a violent crescendo to his reign of terror. After his second escape from custody in Colorado in December 1977, Bundy made his way across the country, eventually arriving in Florida in early January 1978. By this point, Bundy was desperate, with little money, no stable living situation, and the looming threat of law enforcement closing in on him. These circumstances seemed to drive him to even more extreme and reckless behavior, culminating in a series of brutal attacks that would shock the nation. Bundy arrived in Tallahassee and rented a room at a boarding house near Florida State University under the alias Chris Hagen. Despite his fugitive status and the nationwide manhunt for him, Bundy was able to blend into the local community. He spent time at local bars, attended social gatherings, and even interacted with college students, all while hiding in plain sight. His charm and ability to mask his true identity once again allowed him to avoid suspicion. On the night of January 14, 1978, Bundy launched one of his most infamous attacks. Around 2:45 a.m., he broke into the Chi Omega sorority house at Florida State University. Armed with a wooden club, Bundy entered the rooms of 4 women, brutally attacking them as they slept. Margaret Bowman, 21, and Lisa Levy, 20, were killed in the attack, while 2 other women, Karen Chandler and Kathy Kleiner, were severely injured but survived. The crime scene was horrifying. Bundy had inflicted extreme violence on his victims, and in Lisa Levy's case, evidence suggested that he had bitten her, leaving distinct teeth marks that would later become critical evidence in his trial. The attack on the Chi Omega house was unprecedented in its ferocity and brazenness. Bundy had attacked multiple victims in quick succession, all within a short period of time, and then fled the scene before anyone could stop him. The surviving women were left with devastating injuries, both physical and emotional, and the murders sent shockwaves through the university and the surrounding community. The Chi Omega attack marked a turning point in Bundy's criminal behavior. It was a stark departure from his previous modus operandi, which involved luring victims away from public places to secluded locations. In Florida, Bundy seemed to abandon the calculated methods that had allowed him to evade capture for so long, instead opting for chaotic, high-profile violence. Less than an hour after leaving the Chi Omega house, Bundy broke into a nearby apartment and attacked Cheryl Thomas, a 21-year-old dance major at Florida State University. He bludgeoned her so severely that she suffered permanent injuries, including hearing loss and damage to her jaw. Cheryl survived the attack but was left traumatized and physically impaired. Bundy's ability to commit 2 attacks in such quick succession, with no apparent concern for being caught, highlighted his escalating recklessness and lack of regard for consequences. The murders and assaults in Tallahassee left the community in a state of fear and outrage. Florida State University students were terrified, and law enforcement intensified their efforts to capture the perpetrator. Bundy, however, remained on the move. In early February, he stole a car and drove south to Lake City, Florida, where he abducted 12-year-old Kimberly Leach from her school. Kimberly's disappearance was a heartbreaking and tragic escalation in Bundy's crimes. Her body was later discovered in a remote area, showing signs of sexual assault and brutal violence. By this point, Bundy's actions were becoming increasingly erratic. He was no longer the calculated killer who meticulously planned his attacks and covered his tracks. Instead, he seemed driven by desperation and rage, leaving behind a trail of destruction that made it increasingly difficult for him to remain undetected. His decision to attack in public settings and target both adult women and a young girl demonstrated the extent to which he had abandoned any semblance of control. Bundy's downfall came on February 15, 1978, when he was stopped by police in Pensacola, Florida, while driving a stolen vehicle. The officer, David Lee, noticed that the car's license plates were reported stolen and pulled Bundy over. Bundy initially attempted to flee but was quickly subdued and arrested. During his arrest, Bundy gave a fake name and refused to provide any identifying information, but his true identity was soon discovered. His fingerprints matched those of the man wanted for the murders in Colorado, and his capture brought relief to a nation that had been haunted by his crimes. In the days following his arrest, Bundy continued to deny his involvement in the Florida murders, but the evidence against him was overwhelming. Witnesses placed him near the Chi Omega house on the night of the attacks, and the bite marks on Lisa Levy's body were matched to Bundy's dental impressions. This forensic evidence would later prove to be a key factor in his conviction. Bundy's time in Florida represents the culmination of his violent spree and the unraveling of his carefully constructed facade. His actions during this period were marked by an escalation in both the frequency and brutality of his attacks, reflecting a man who was no longer able to control his impulses. The murders in Tallahassee and the abduction of Kimberly Leach shocked the nation and cemented Bundy's reputation as one of the most dangerous and depraved criminals in American history. While his capture brought an end to his killing spree, the scars he left on his victims, their families, and the communities he terrorized would endure for years to come. Ted Bundy's trial for the Chi Omega murders in 1979 was a watershed moment in American legal history. It was one of the first trials to be nationally televised, giving millions of people an unprecedented glimpse into the judicial process and the twisted mind of a serial killer. Bundy's trial became a media circus, as his charisma, arrogance, and insistence on representing himself turned the courtroom into a theater of the macabre. For Bundy, it was not just a trial but a stage on which he could continue to manipulate, charm, and seek the spotlight. The trial was held in Miami, Florida, after a change of venue was granted to ensure a fairer jury selection process. Despite this, the publicity surrounding the case made it nearly impossible to find jurors who had not heard of Bundy or the heinous crimes he was accused of committing. The evidence against Bundy was damning. Witnesses had seen him near the Chi Omega house on the night of the murders, and the bite marks on Lisa Levy's body were conclusively matched to Bundy's dental impressions. Nevertheless, Bundy maintained his innocence, portraying himself as the victim of a judicial system that had unfairly targeted him. From the outset, Bundy sought to control the narrative of his trial. He fired his legal counsel multiple times, insisting on representing himself, a decision that would later be seen as one of his greatest missteps. Bundy's legal knowledge, while substantial for a layman, was no match for the prosecution's experienced team. Yet Bundy's decision to act as his own attorney was not purely strategic. It was also a reflection of his inflated ego and belief in his ability to manipulate the system. By representing himself, Bundy ensured that he would have direct access to the courtroom floor, allowing him to cross-examine witnesses, make opening and closing statements, and engage directly with the judge and jury. Bundy's behavior in court was erratic and often inappropriate. At times, he presented himself as composed, intelligent, and articulate, attempting to charm the jury and the media. He smiled for cameras, joked with reporters, and even flirted with female journalists covering the trial. These moments of charm, however, were interspersed with bouts of anger, arrogance, and self-righteousness. Bundy frequently clashed with Judge Edward Cowart, who presided over the trial. While Cowart remained professional, he did not shy away from expressing his frustration with Bundy's antics, at one point telling him, "You're intelligent enough to know better." The prosecution, led by State Attorney Larry Simpson, methodically laid out the evidence against Bundy. The cornerstone of their case was the bite mark evidence. Forensic odontologists testified that the marks on Lisa Levy's body matched Bundy's unique dental impressions, providing a crucial link between Bundy and the crime scene. This evidence was groundbreaking at the time, as bite mark analysis had not been widely used in criminal trials. The prosecution also presented eyewitness testimony, fibers from Bundy's clothing that matched those found at the scene, and physical evidence from Bundy's vehicle. In contrast, Bundy's defense was disorganized and largely ineffective. While he attempted to sow doubt by challenging the credibility of witnesses and the validity of forensic evidence, his lack of legal expertise and tendency to grandstand often worked against him. His cross-examinations were sometimes aggressive and confrontational, further alienating the jury. Moreover, Bundy's decision to put himself on display during the trial backfired, as it gave jurors a first-hand look at his arrogance and manipulative tendencies. Throughout the trial, Bundy continued to play to the media, using the cameras as an opportunity to maintain his image and garner sympathy from the public. He portrayed himself as a misunderstood and wrongfully accused man, a tactic that attracted a bizarre following of supporters, including women who believed in his innocence and were drawn to his charisma. This phenomenon, often referred to as Bundy mania, highlighted the disturbing fascination some people had with Bundy, despite the horrifying nature of his crimes. The trial reached its climax with Bundy's dramatic closing arguments, during which he attempted to appeal directly to the jury's emotions. He spoke passionately about the presumption of innocence and the burden of proof, but his efforts were undermined by the overwhelming evidence against him and his erratic courtroom behavior. The jury deliberated for less than 7 hours before returning a guilty verdict on 2 counts of first-degree murder, 3 counts of attempted murder, and 2 counts of burglary. During the sentencing phase, Bundy's demeanor shifted. While he initially maintained his defiant and self-assured attitude, the gravity of the situation began to weigh on him. The prosecution argued for the death penalty, citing the brutality of the crimes and Bundy's lack of remorse. Bundy attempted to present mitigating factors, including his lack of a prior criminal record, but his arguments were unconvincing. Judge Cowart sentenced Bundy to death in the electric chair, a decision that was met with cheers from spectators both inside and outside the courtroom. In a surprising and theatrical moment during the sentencing phase, Bundy proposed marriage to his then-girlfriend, Carol Ann Boone, who had been one of his staunchest supporters throughout the trial. Bundy orchestrated the proposal in such a way that it occurred in open court, making the marriage legally binding under Florida law. Boone accepted, further cementing her role as one of the most controversial figures in Bundy's life. The proposal was seen by many as a final act of defiance and a calculated attempt to maintain control over his narrative. Judge Cowart, despite his frustration with Bundy's behavior, offered an unexpectedly compassionate farewell during sentencing. He told Bundy, "You're a bright young man. You'd have made a good lawyer, and I'd have loved to have you practice in front of me. But you went another way, partner." These words, though kind, underscored the tragedy of Bundy's life. A man with potential who chose a path of violence and destruction. The trial was a landmark moment, not only in the case against Ted Bundy, but also in the history of the criminal justice system. It showcased the power of forensic evidence, the impact of media coverage on high-profile cases, and the dangers of allowing a manipulative and narcissistic individual to represent himself in court. For Bundy, the trial was the beginning of the end, as it marked the first of several convictions that would solidify his fate. For the victims and their families, it was a step toward justice, though the scars left by Bundy's crimes would never fully heal. Ted Bundy's journey to death row was marked by a mix of defiance, manipulation, and an eventual reluctant acknowledgement of the horrors he had committed. After being convicted and sentenced to death in Florida for the Chi Omega murders, Bundy continued to fight the legal system at every turn. His time on death row was as calculated as his crimes, as he used every opportunity to delay his execution, maintain control over his narrative, and draw attention to himself. Following his conviction in 1979, Bundy faced additional charges for the abduction and murder of Kimberly Leach, a 12-year-old girl he had kidnapped and killed shortly after the Chi Omega attacks. The trial for Kimberly's murder was held in Orlando, Florida, in early 1980. The evidence against Bundy was again overwhelming. Witnesses had seen Bundy near Kimberly's school on the day of her disappearance, and fibers matching those from Bundy's vehicle were found on her body. Despite his claims of innocence, Bundy was convicted and sentenced to death once more, solidifying his fate. For Bundy, these convictions were not the end of his fight. He filed a series of appeals, exploiting every legal avenue available to delay his execution. Bundy's legal maneuvers were often accompanied by public statements in which he continued to assert his innocence, painting himself as a victim of a corrupt and unjust system. His refusal to take responsibility for his actions frustrated prosecutors, law enforcement, and the families of his victims who were desperate for closure. While on death row, Bundy maintained a level of influence and control that few other inmates could achieve. He granted interviews to journalists, wrote letters to supporters, and even provided insights into the psychology of serial killers to law enforcement. His cooperation with authorities was not entirely altruistic. Bundy saw these interactions as a way to stay relevant and prolong his life. He believed that by offering useful information, he could position himself as too valuable to execute. One of the most notable aspects of Bundy's time on death row was his gradual shift in demeanor as his execution date drew closer. While he initially denied any involvement in the murders, Bundy began to open up about his crimes during the final years of his life. These confessions were not made out of remorse, but rather as part of a calculated strategy to delay his execution. By confessing to additional murders and providing details about the locations of victims' remains, Bundy hoped to convince authorities that his life was worth sparing in exchange for solving cold cases. Bundy's confessions revealed the true extent of his depravity. He admitted to killing at least 30 women across multiple states, though investigators believe the actual number of victims could be much higher. Bundy's descriptions of his crimes were chilling in their detail, as he recounted how he stalked, abducted, and murdered his victims. He spoke about the power and control he felt during these acts, offering a disturbing glimpse into the mind of a predator. For law enforcement, Bundy's confessions were both a breakthrough and a source of frustration. While they provided answers in some cases, Bundy's evasiveness and refusal to confess to all his crimes left many questions unanswered. During this period, Bundy's relationship with Carol Ann Boone, who had married him during his trial, began to deteriorate. Boone had been one of Bundy's most ardent supporters, believing in his innocence despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary. She even had a child with Bundy, conceived during a brief period of physical contact allowed during prison visits. However, as Bundy's confessions became public, Boone could no longer reconcile the man she loved with the monster he truly was. She eventually cut ties with Bundy, taking their daughter and moving away from the public eye. As Bundy's execution date approached in 1989, he made one final attempt to save himself. He offered to confess to additional murders in exchange for a stay of execution, hoping to prolong his life indefinitely by withholding critical information. This tactic, however, failed to sway authorities, who were determined to carry out the sentence. Bundy's manipulative strategies, which had served him well for so long, were no longer effective. On January 24, 1989, after years of legal battles and delays, Ted Bundy was executed in the electric chair at Florida State Prison. His final moments were marked by a mix of defiance and resignation. He declined a formal last meal, opting instead for a simple breakfast of eggs, toast, and coffee. In his final statement, Bundy expressed remorse for his actions, but many saw this as insincere and self-serving, a last-ditch effort to salvage some semblance of humanity. Outside the prison, a large crowd gathered to celebrate Bundy's execution. People cheered, held signs, and even set off fireworks, viewing his death as a moment of justice for the countless lives he had destroyed. For the families of his victims, Bundy's execution brought a sense of closure, though the pain and loss caused by his crimes could never truly be erased. Bundy's time on death row and eventual execution marked the end of one of the darkest chapters in American criminal history. His ability to manipulate the legal system and maintain public attention highlighted the complexities of dealing with a criminal as cunning and dangerous as Bundy, while his execution ensured that he would never harm anyone again. His story continues to serve as a grim reminder of the capacity for evil that can hide behind a mask of charm and normalcy. Ted Bundy's execution on January 24, 1989, marked the culmination of one of the most chilling and infamous cases in American history. However, the impact of his crimes and the lessons learned from his capture, trials, and eventual execution resonate far beyond that fateful day. Bundy's death brought an end to his reign of terror, but his legacy serves as a stark reminder of the horrors that can lurk behind a facade of normalcy, as well as a testament to the resilience and determination of the justice system and the families of his victims. In the early hours of January 24, 1989, Bundy was led to the execution chamber at Florida State Prison. The atmosphere was tense, as this moment had been delayed for years by Bundy's manipulative legal tactics and a string of appeals. His execution was witnessed by a small group, including law enforcement officials, journalists, and a spiritual advisor. Bundy had spent his final hours speaking with a minister and reading scripture, though whether these actions reflected genuine remorse or another calculated performance remains unclear. As he was strapped into the electric chair, Bundy appeared calm, though his expressions of regret in his final moments were met with skepticism. Before the switch was flipped, Bundy uttered his last words. "Jim and Fred, I'd like you to give my love to my family and friends." These words, directed at his defense team, were simple and understated, devoid of any direct acknowledgement of his crimes or the suffering he had caused. At 7:16 a.m., Bundy was pronounced dead, and his execution was met with cheers and celebrations from the crowd gathered outside the prison. The scene outside Florida State Prison on the morning of Bundy's execution was unlike anything seen before. Hundreds of people had gathered, some holding signs and banners reading "Burn Bundy, Burn," and other messages expressing relief and vindication. Fireworks lit up the sky, and people chanted in celebration. For the families of Bundy's victims, this moment brought a sense of justice, though it could never truly erase the pain and loss they had endured. The public's reaction reflected not just a sense of closure, but also the collective horror and outrage over Bundy's crimes, which had gripped the nation for more than a decade. While Bundy's death ended his ability to inflict further harm, his story did not end with his execution. In the years since, Bundy has remained a subject of intense fascination, both as a case study for criminologists and psychologists, and as a figure in popular culture. Books, documentaries, and films have examined every aspect of his life, from his troubled childhood and calculated crimes to his courtroom antics and eventual capture. This enduring interest in Bundy speaks to the public's fascination with understanding the mind of a killer and the societal factors that allowed him to operate for so long. Bundy's case also had a profound impact on law enforcement and the criminal justice system. His ability to commit murders across multiple states exposed significant flaws in communication and cooperation between jurisdictions. At the time of his killing spree in the 1970s, there were no centralized databases or standardized methods for sharing information about serial crimes. Bundy exploited these gaps, moving from state to state and evading detection for years. In response to cases like Bundy's, significant advancements were made in forensic science, criminal profiling, and interagency communication. The introduction of databases like the FBI's Violent Criminal Apprehension Program, VICAP, was in part a result of the challenges law enforcement faced in tracking Bundy's crimes. VICAP allows law enforcement agencies across the country to share information about unsolved crimes, helping to identify patterns and links between cases. Bundy's case also underscored the importance of forensic evidence, such as the bite mark analysis that played a key role in his conviction. While some of these methods have since been scrutinized for their reliability, Bundy's trials helped pave the way for the modern use of forensic science in criminal investigations. For criminologists and psychologists, Bundy became a case study in psychopathy and the behavior of serial killers. His ability to lead a double life, appearing charming, intelligent, and likable while committing unspeakable acts of violence, has been the subject of extensive analysis. Bundy displayed many of the hallmark traits of a psychopath, including a lack of empathy, a manipulative personality, and a superficial charm that masked his true nature. Studying Bundy's behavior has provided valuable insights into the minds of other serial offenders, helping law enforcement and mental health professionals develop strategies for identifying and understanding similar individuals. Bundy's story also brought attention to the vulnerabilities of his victims and the societal factors that allowed him to exploit them. Many of Bundy's victims were young women who trusted him because he appeared non-threatening, polite, and in need of help. Bundy's use of a fake injury or distress to lure his victims highlighted the dangers of blind trust and the importance of personal safety awareness. Advocacy groups and educational campaigns emerged in the wake of Bundy's crimes, aiming to empower individuals, especially women, to recognize and avoid potentially dangerous situations. Despite the public's fascination with Bundy, it is crucial to remember the human cost of his actions. The lives he took were not just statistics. They were daughters, sisters, and friends whose futures were stolen in the most brutal ways imaginable. The families of Bundy's victims have had to live with the pain of their loss, as well as the media's continued focus on the man who caused it. Many of these families have worked tirelessly to honor their loved ones' memories, establishing scholarships, charities, and other initiatives to ensure that their lives are remembered for more than the manner in which they ended. Ted Bundy's death brought an end to his ability to harm others, but the lessons from his life and crimes continue to shape our understanding of violence, justice, and humanity's capacity for both evil and resilience. His story is a chilling reminder of how appearances can be deceiving and how unchecked evil can wreak havoc on countless lives. Bundy's case remains a cautionary tale, a source of pain for those who were touched by his actions, and a dark chapter in the history of crime and justice. Yet it is also a testament to the determination of law enforcement, the advancements in criminal justice, and the enduring strength of the human spirit in the face of unimaginable tragedy.